Hi everyone, my name is Madeline Colgren. I'm a senior at Goucher College, Spanish and French double major, and I'd like to welcome you to the presentation of my dissertation for the 2021 Goucher Symposium. Before I begin, I'd like to point out that my dissertation is written in French, but this presentation will be in English. There will be some parts in French, but I will translate and explain everything as I go. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. The original title of my dissertation at the top of this slide is Le communautarisme et la communauté trans en France, une étude socio-culturelle. In English, it's Le communautarisme, multiculturalism, and the trans community in France. Later in this presentation, I will discuss the term communautarisme and explain why I chose to keep the French word in my English title. Before moving on, I want to talk about the picture on this slide. It's a flyer distributed by the PAST Association of Paris, which is where I started an internship last year before coming home due to COVID. The background of the image shows Marianne, a female personification of liberty and the French Republic, depicted in the well-known painting Liberty Leading the People by Eugène Delacroix. The foreground represents the transgender community, and it calls for equality, dignity, work, liberty, and respect for transgender people. I think it's perfect for this presentation because in my dissertation, I analyze how certain values of the French Republic impact the trans community, as well as other minority communities. In order to avoid any misunderstanding about the trans community, I want to take the time to define some terms. The acronym LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, is used to refer to the LGBT community as a whole. I focus on the trans community in my dissertation, but there is a common history of activism among the entire LGBT community. The T stands for transgender, but that is not the only term that can be used. PAST clarifies in their activity report that transsexual, trans, and transsexed are a few of many terms to describe any person, operated or not, whose gender identity, expression, and/or behavior does not align with their biological sex. It is important to understand that gender identity is independent of biological sex. Now we can begin. My internship at the PAST Association played an important role in my decision to do research related to the transgender community. In English, the PAST acronym stands for Prevention, Action, Health, Work for Transgender People. PAST was founded in 1992 by Camille Cabral, who is the current director of the association. In order to understand the main goals of PAST, it's necessary to understand Camille's background. Camille Cabral is a doctor originally from Brazil. She came to Paris in 1980 to finish her medical studies. On a side note, Camille ran for council member in the 17th District of Paris in 2001 and became the first transgender person elected in the history of the French Republic. During her 5 years working at the St. Louis Hospital in the 80s, she played a key role in helping Brazilian and Latin American sex workers. Unfortunately, a new director at the hospital asked her to leave because he didn't want a transgender person working there. Camille says she didn't do anything at the time because she didn't know about anti-discrimination laws. After losing her job at the hospital, she accepted a scholarship to take on a research project concerning HIV. Camille and her friend Sonia Castelletti carried out the project by driving around the Bois de Boulogne Park in Paris and talking to sex workers. Their intent was to prevent the spread of diseases by talking to the women about AIDS and the importance of using condoms. This research project led to the creation of PAST in 1992. Camille's research project served to protect and inform the women in Bois de Boulogne. Now the association she founded seeks to do the same, and its capacity to protect and inform is even stronger. Camille and Sonia bought a bus in order to widen the scope of their efforts. This bus remains a central component of the association's services. On the next slide, there are two images that show the PAST bus as well as Camille Cabral at a gay pride parade. There are a couple of signs in French that I will translate. As you can see, the PAST bus is shown in the photo on the left. And on the right, Camille Cabral can be found in the center of the photo wearing sunglasses. Some of the signs say, equality, rights, work, a place in society. One sign is covered, but it says stop violence against trans people, and in the very back is the PAST logo. These photos are representative of Camille Cabral's immense dedication to serving the trans community. a Brazilian news source considers PAST to be one of the world's largest networks for transgender people, immigrants, and sex workers. The PAST Association amplifies demands for equality by increasing visibility of the trans community in public spaces. Now I'm going to talk about the content of my dissertation and how I chose my topic. So here's my little roadmap that shows the steps of how I chose my topic. This journey starts at step 1 with my internship at the PAST Association. Our dissertations were meant to be related in some way to our internships. So step 2, I knew my topic would somehow be related to the transgender community. When speaking to my advisor in Paris about possible topics, I used the phrase transgender community, and she started talking about step 3, le communautarisme, and how c'est un mot qui fait peur. It's a scary word. And I was very confused because I had never heard of it before. So step 4, what is communautarisme? My advisor was explaining that in France, the idea of different communities doesn't really exist. And that's the main point I got from the conversation, but I was very lost because that didn't make sense to me. Wasn't the trans community a community? At this point, I started researching communautarisme. I'm going to pause this roadmap discussion and cut to what I discovered about this scary word. The simplest definition of le communautarisme is the existence of separate communities. What's interesting is that this definition doesn't make sense on its own. What does that actually mean, and why is it scary in France? To answer these questions, I listened to podcasts and read more articles than I can remember. But I found out that the main conflict with this word, le communautarisme, is that it contradicts the core values of the French Republic. So my next goal was to understand these values. You may or may not have heard of France's motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. These words are core values of the French Republic. I took this picture of a monument in La Place de la République in Paris. Marianne, the woman holding the flag in the painting on my title slide, stands on top. She is surrounded by 3 statues that personify liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French Republic also values unity. It is viewed that the existence of separate communities, or communautarisme, threatens this unity and in turn threatens the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the Republic. In France, the government distinguishes between the public and private sphere in order to manage multicultural differences. Theoretically, differences in the public sphere lead to social fragmentation and threaten equal treatment of all citizens. Unfortunately, arguments against communautarisme are often used to discriminate against Muslims and Islam in the public sphere. Secularism, Islamophobia, and racism in France are at the heart of debates about communautarisme. I discussed this more thoroughly in my dissertation, but with limited time in my presentation, I wanted to at least mention the subject. When I came across the distinction between the public and private space, I realized why I was so confused while talking to my advisor. Not only did I not know the word communautarisme, but the concept itself was completely foreign to me. In the United States, multiculturalism in the public sphere is encouraged. The cultural melting pot concept is an important part of our country's identity. I want to talk briefly about my use of multiculturalism in the English title of my dissertation. Even though I used multiculturalism in my English title as a translation for communautarisme, I want to point out that these words are not equivalent. The word multiculturalism doesn't spark the same fearful reaction that communautarisme does in France. Communautarisme is a very French concept, which is why I chose to keep the French word in my English title. Now that I understood the significance of communautarisme in France, I asked myself, step 5, how it affected the transgender community. It's a community that's becoming more and more visible in the public sphere. Does that make French society more divided? Is the PAST association linked to communautarisme? These questions helped lead me to the final step, finalizing my topic. In short, my dissertation analyzes the French government's relationship with minority communities, with a focus on the trans community, in order to understand the connection between theoretical debates about communautarisme and the reality of minority communities. This is the abstract of my dissertation that further explains my topic. You can pause the video for your convenience. In this last part of my presentation, I want to discuss some direct connections I found between the trans community in France and communautarisme. The image on this slide shows protesters holding a banner that says "Stop forcing sterilization to get documents," which refers to obtaining a sex change on one's government documents. According to a website that provides information and advice for transgender people, one of the first things a transgender person wants to do is change their civil status in order to no longer be administratively attached to the sex they were assigned at birth. Unfortunately, a common problem transgender people face is having their civil status change requests refused. Changing one's civil status in France was not permitted until 1992. In fact, in 1990, the first civil chamber of the Court of Cassation ruled that a sex change, even if medically recognized, does not mean that a person's sex has fully acquired the characteristics of the opposite sex, and therefore does not require the attribution to the transgender person a sex that is not actually his or her own. This decision was most notably criticized by the European Court of Human Rights. The threat of being condemned by this court prompted France to issue a revised law in 1992. The revision allowed a person to change their civil status on the condition they have undergone an irreversible medical operation, resulting in infertility, and the possibility to be refused a civil status change still existed. In 2016, 24 years later, France finally removed the requirement for a medical operation. But unfortunately, the process is still judicialized because a person wishing to change their civil status must present themselves in front of a high court, which can be stressful. Changing one's civil status is just one of many issues that the trans community has faced. To understand how this example relates to France's opposition of communautarisme, we need to take the principle of universality into consideration. France takes pride in promoting equality through the universal application of laws. However, this example of changing one's civil status demonstrates that policies can be applied equally to everyone, but can have a negative impact on one part of the population, in this case, the trans community. Sometimes it's necessary to consider the particular needs of certain groups in order to effectively carry out equal treatment for all citizens. When equally applied laws do not result in equality for all citizens, intentionally or not, the excluded are automatically separated from the majority. Camille Cabral further explains this point in a response from an interview I did with her. Camille states that the main argument for groups of people to organize or mobilize politically is based on situations of threatened non-recognition or discrimination from other people or a system that denies equal rights to community groups. In other words, a community's apparent separation doesn't necessarily indicate desires to exist separately from the French Republic, but rather it indicates the existence of inequalities needing to be addressed. There wouldn't be a need for transgender people to come together as a community and demand equal rights if they were already receiving equal treatment under the law. This brings me to my conclusion. On a personal level, I'm beyond grateful to have had the opportunity to work with the PAST Association. I learned so much in such a short period of time, and although I'm no expert, I am so much more informed about the transgender community. Doing research through the lens of PAST gave me an entirely new perspective on French values and identities. On a larger scale, writing this dissertation enabled me to not only see France in a new light, but also the United States. When I started writing, I had a very clear-cut idea in mind that France didn't acknowledge minority groups, while on the other hand, the US encouraged their visibility and fights for equality. While this is true to some extent, I had a realization when I had nearly finished the dissertation. I was writing the conclusion to my paper at the end of May last year, in 2020, around the time George Floyd was murdered. I remember feeling so frustrated with people using the phrases "All Lives Matter" or "Blue Lives Matter" as a counterattack against the Black Lives Matter movement. The movement isn't against white lives, it simply demands justice and equality for Black lives. I realized that this situation was comparable to minority communities in France who come together demanding equality and representation because they are shut down with arguments against communautarisme. The groups are accused of perpetuating societal division just like Black Lives Matter was accused of doing the same. Language is important. Paying attention to the context in which certain phrases and arguments are deployed can help identify what people or systems seek to protect. Those who fear losing their majority status in society use phrases like all lives matter, or use communautarisme as a scare word anytime a minority community demands equal treatment. My dissertation doesn't constitute a solution to inequality, which might never exist, but rather an analysis of how inequality exists and is addressed in France. I found that the concept of communautarisme and the fear surrounding it are not really based in reality, but the use of the term affects the reality of how minority groups are perceived by depicting them as a threat to national unity. This creates an obstacle for universal equality, which is a pillar of the French Republic. There is so much to say about this topic, especially since it's so relevant to what's currently being done in France to combat communautarisme. However, due to time, I will wrap up my conclusion with a quote from Audre Lorde, an American poet and civil rights activist. She says, "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." It's clear that the way communautarisme exists in French political discourse prevents this recognition, acceptance, and celebration to take place. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you found it interesting and informative. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach me by email. Merci.